you have to be able to recognize and say times in the 12-hour clock or 12-hour format and the 24-hour clock or the 24-hour format. And there are important differences which I will point out using examples. Well, the 12-hour format is probably the one you're more accustomed to, and people tend to use that one when talking to each other, so you'll be more familiar with it. Well, let's just take a time of day, for example. So let's suppose that the time right now is 1:15 in the afternoon. Okay, let's say 1:15 in the afternoon. Now, if we were writing that in the 12-hour format, remember we're not writing it in words, we're writing it in numbers, we would call that 1:15 p.m., 1:15 in the afternoon. Whereas, if we were writing it in the 24-hour clock, then it would look quite different. 1:15 in the afternoon, written in the 24-hour format, would look like this. Just 13:15. So I'm going to show you how to convert any time from 12 to 24-hour format and vice versa. So using this example, I can point out some important differences. The first one is that this one has PM and this one doesn't. This one, well, the minutes are the same in both, 15 minutes. This is an important thing to point out straight away, is that whether you're doing the 12-hour clock or the 24-hour clock, the minutes don't change. So the minutes are 15 either way, but the hours are different. One in the afternoon is 13 hours on the 24-hour clock, and whereas this has a PM, this does not. Now, if we take a day and look at various times throughout the day and do the conversion, that should help you to see clearly how to do that. This is a question that when I ask children in class, normally they're not able to answer. See if you know the answer. At what time does one day end and the next day begin? It's quite straightforward. In fact, it's midnight. So if this is the start of the day, this would be midnight. So the previous day has just ended and the new day will begin at midnight. So this day we're talking about, let's suppose it's today, began at midnight last night, and it will end at midnight tonight. And in the middle of the day, no surprise, is midday, which is also called noon. Now, all times on the 12-hour clock must have AM or PM. They must have AM or PM after them, except these times, midnight and midday. The reason for this is because of the meaning of AM and PM, which I'll come to in a moment. But let's do some translating. Let's translate midnight and midday into the 24-hour clock. Well, midnight on the 24-hour clock looks like this. We have no hours, but we still have 2 digits for the hours, and no minutes. 2 digits for the minutes. So that's the essential thing about the 24-hour format, is you always have 2 digits for the hours, even if it's naught, or even a single digit hour, you'd still put, for example, you'd say 0600, not just 600, 0600. Also, with the 24-hour format, you can just write the 4 digits one after the other as I did here, or you can leave a little gap, or you can put a dot, or you can put a colon. It's optional. I tend to just write the 4 digits, but it may be easier for you if you put a colon to separate the hours from the minutes. It doesn't matter. So that's 0000, and then the day will also end at 0000. So when the minutes are naught in the 24-hour clock, we just read that as 100. Obviously, it isn't 100, but that's the traditional way of saying it. Midday is written as 1200. Okay, so those are, if you like, they give us a framework, and we'll put in other times in between now. So 1 hour after midnight, what is the time? Well, it's going to be 1 o'clock in the morning, or 1 a.m. An hour later, it will be 2 a.m. So what happens in the 24-hour clock? Well, 1 a.m., 1 hour after 0000 will be 0100. And an hour later, it will be 0200. So the hours have increased by 1 each time. And so it would go on, 0300, 0400, and so on. And on the 12-hour clock, the same thing, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., etc. Now let's suppose that this morning I woke up at 6:25. Let's suppose. Let's convert that one. 6:25 would be 6:25 a.m. Now I want to convert that into the 24-hour format. This is what it would look like. Well, first of all, I must have 2 digits for the hours. So although it's only 6, I must write 06. And the minutes don't change whether you're converting this way or that. It's still going to be 25 minutes, so it's 0625. No AM or PM. You never write AM or PM in the 24-hour format. So here, whereas in the 12-hour format you must have AM or PM, except at 12, midnight and midday. But in the 24-hour format you must never have AM or PM. But you must have 2 digits for the hours and 2 digits for the minutes. Okay, just to hopefully make it a little clearer, I'll put 12 in front of midnight and midday. So that is converting a morning time from 12 to 24 hours. Let's now suppose that, yes, that's the time I woke up, and then my post arrived at 9:23. So supposing it was 09:23 when my post arrived this morning, how would I write that in the 12-hour format? Well, seeing as it is a single-digit hour, 09, I would just write it as 9:23, not 09:23 a.m. So in other words, in the 12-hour format, if it is a single-digit hour, you just write a single digit. And the minutes don't change, but because it's morning, I absolutely must put AM. Okay, let's carry on then. 10 a.m., 11 a.m., and then you'd get to midday. And on the 24-hour side, it would be 1000. Note, you don't read that as 1000. It looks like 1000, but you read it as 1000. So you say the hours separately from the minutes. 1100. Okay. Now something happens. After 11 a.m., you get 12 noon or midday. Whereas here, you just get 1200. 1 hour later, what happens? Well, it's now 1 in the afternoon, which is 1 p.m. Whereas here, 1 in the afternoon will simply be 1300. So in other words, the hours just keep increasing by 1 every hour until you come to the end of the day. It's called the 12-hour clock because we only go up to 12 and then start again. Whereas here, we go all the way up to 24. I'll contradict myself shortly because you never actually see 2400. What it does, it goes back to 0. After 2359 and 59 seconds, 1 second later, you don't see 2400. It goes back to 0 because it's the start of the next day. So you get 000. Let's carry on. 2 p.m. would be 1400. 1500. Okay. Let's suppose that I stop for a cup of tea at 3:47 p.m. Now, what time will that be on the 24-hour clock? Well, because the 12-hour clock goes up to 12 and then starts again, whereas the 24-hour clock just carries on, when you come to the afternoon times, the hours on the 24-hour clock would always be 12 more than the hours on the 12-hour clock. So in other words, if this is 3 hours, then this will be 15 hours. So 3 in the afternoon would be 1500. But of course the minutes don't change, it's 47, so it's 1547, and we drop the PM because we never have AM or PM in the 24-hour clock. So that's very straightforward. There are two things for you to think about. Is how do you write the hours? And remember, should you have the AM, PM or not? It's the same here. How do you write the hours? And should you have AM or PM or not? So there we are. Now, let's suppose that I get a telephone call in the evening, and the time when I got the call on my mobile, it said 21:14. That's what the time on my mobile said. What is that in the 12-hour format? Well, as soon as the hours go over 12 on the 24-hour clock and you want to know what the hours would be in the 12-hour format, you subtract 12. The difference would always be 12 hours. So subtract 12 from 21, and that is 9 p.m. So 9. Of course, the minutes don't change. It's 14 minutes past the hour. 9:14 p.m. So when it comes to the afternoon times, the difference in the number of hours would always be 12 when you're converting. So let's carry on. You get 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and then 1 hour later it is midnight or 12 midnight. Whereas here, 10 p.m., remember it's a 12-hour difference, would be 2200, an hour later 2300, and then 1 hour later, not 2400, the clock goes back to 0, you get 0:00. So that's how the times are written. Now let me come back to why don't we put AM or PM with 12 o'clock on the 12-hour clock? Well, you will see it and you'll hear it, but technically it's wrong. I'll explain now the reason why it's wrong. AM and PM are needed in the 12-hour clock. They are not needed in the 24-hour clock. The reason is because on the 24-hour clock, each hour only occurs once in the day. There's only one 0600. There's only one 1300. There's no repetition of a time. Whereas in the 12-hour clock, there is repetition of every single time. There are two 2 o'clocks. There's a 2 o'clock here and a 2 o'clock here. There are two 10 o'clocks. There's a 10 o'clock here and a 10 o'clock here. So to distinguish between the two versions of each time, you have to have AM or PM so you know which one you're talking about. Otherwise, it's ambiguous, meaning it has two meanings. So in the 12-hour clock, you must have AM or PM with all the times except midnight and midday. So what is AM? Well, it's Latin. And PM is post, meridium. What does this mean? Well, ante means before, and meridium is midday. Post means after, meridium means midday. So AM means before midday, and PM means after midday. So let's now apply the meaning of AM and PM to our 12-hour clock to see. 1 hour or 1 o'clock before midday, 1 o'clock after midday. So we know which one we're talking about. Is it the one before midday or is it the one after midday? 2 a.m., the 2 o'clock before midday. 2 p.m., the 2 o'clock, after midday. All makes perfect sense. 11 a.m., 11 o'clock before midday. 11 p.m., the 11 o'clock after midday. So there's no ambiguity there. Now let's look at midday itself. Is 12 noon, i.e. 12 midday, before midday, or is it after midday? Exactly, it's neither. Therefore, if you put 12 a.m., you're saying it's 12 before midday. Or if you put p.m., you're saying it's 12 after midday. And neither one makes sense because this is actually midday. It's meridian, not a.m. or p.m. So it makes no sense here. Now let's look at midnight. Midnight. Remember, the next day also starts at midnight. So is this 12 p.m., i.e. is it 12 before midday, or is it 12 after midday? Well, it depends which midday you're talking about. And also we've got two midnights, one at the start of the day, one at the end of the day. Which one shall we call before midday and which one shall we call before after midday? So there isn't, putting AM or PM after 12 o'clock doesn't actually inform us which one we're talking about. And the purpose of AM and PM is to clear away any ambiguity about whether we're talking about these hours or those hours. When you use AM and PM with 12 o'clock, it doesn't do that. And therefore, you should use midnight and midday or noon to distinguish between the two different 12 o'clocks. Well, that's all very straightforward. You just have to know a few simple facts about the formats, and you can do it. But I want to show you a little bit of calculation that you could do that involves using the clock in the two different formats. You can get questions which are like this, where you have to work out how long a journey took, for example. So you could get a question which asks you that, supposing you started a journey, I'm drawing a line, a timeline to indicate the journey. Supposing you started the journey at 10:36 a.m. and you arrived at your destination at 6:11 p.m. And the question is, how long did the journey take? Now, there are lots of ways to do this, and I'm going to show you just one way, the way that I recommend, which, if you like, makes it simple, makes it intuitive. This is what I would do. First of all, I noticed that these are 12-hour times, not 24-hour. And I noticed that we started AM and we finished PM. And I know that when it changes over from AM to PM, it means that the clock went back to naught in the middle. So I could easily miscount the hours if I don't take account of that fact. So because it did change from AM to PM, I know that it went through midday or 12 noon. So when I count up my hours, I've got to keep that in mind. This is what I do. This is the start, this is the end. Work your way from the start to the end, making strategic jumps or leaps like this. From 10:36 a.m., jump forward to the next o'clock time, which would be 11 a.m. And think, well, how many minutes is it? There are 60 minutes in an hour. That's no different whether you're using the 12-hour clock or the 24-hour clock. 60 minutes in an hour. That is the reason why I pointed out that although we read this as 1100, it doesn't mean there are 100 minutes in an hour. There are 60 minutes in an hour. We just read it as 1100. It's a tradition. But there are always 60 minutes in an hour. So from 10:36 up to 11 a.m. is actually 24 minutes. So that jump is 24 minutes. And then from 11 a.m. to 12 noon is just 1 hour. And then from 12 noon, we jump to the last o'clock time we have, which is 6 p.m. from 12 noon to 6 p.m. is just 6 hours. And then the last little jump is the minutes past 6, which was 11. And what I've just done here is very conveniently broken down the journey from start to end into minutes at the beginning, hours in the middle, and minutes at the end. And all I have to do now is add them all together to get the total journey time. Notice I haven't taken any trouble to try and make the jumps look in proportion. If I did, this jump would be 6 times as big as that jump, and so on. There's no need for that. It's these numbers that are important and the concept. So when I add them together, I have 1 hour plus 6 hours. So 1 plus 6 hours and 24 plus 11 minutes, which is 7 hours and 35 minutes. And that is how long this journey took. Very straightforward. So key things: minutes at the beginning, hours in the middle, minutes at the end. If you do change from AM to PM or PM to AM, you must mark in the 12 noon or the 12 midnight so that you remember to stop off there. It will help you to keep track of the hours. Now, let's take an example. We're using the 24-hour clock. Let's suppose that a flight went from Heathrow to Sydney in Australia, and that it set off from Heathrow at 15:35 on Thursday, and then it arrived in Sydney at 14:52 on Friday, the following day. Now, because it's gone from one day into the next day, it definitely went through midnight. So somewhere near the middle, we'll put midnight, which is 0000 in the 24-hour clock. We do exactly the same as we did before. From 15:35, 1600 would be the nearest o'clock time. And from 15:35 to 1600 is 25 minutes. Remember, there are 60 minutes in an hour. We read it as 1600, but it's not literally 100 minutes. It's just the way of saying it. And then from 1600 to 0000 would be 8 hours. Because remember, 0000 is the equivalent of 2400, 8 hours. And the last o'clock time before we reached Sydney was 1400. So we'll stop off there. From 0000 to 1400 is 14 hours. And then the last little jump was 52 minutes. Again, let's add them, 8 hours and 14 hours. And then 25 minutes plus 52 minutes. So that's 8 and 14, 22 hours, and 25 plus 52 is 77 minutes. Now, you won't see an answer like this because 77 minutes takes you over an hour. So this is an hour and 17 minutes. So you'd have to add on 1 to the hours and then reduce the minutes to 17. So that is 23 hours and 17 minutes. As I've mentioned, there are other ways of doing this, but I recommend this method because it's very clear and intuitive.